Let me welcome you to this next panel, which will try to address the profound transformation of the European security landscape. With Russia's war on Ukraine, undermining the very principles of what established peace in Europe in a way more than 50 years ago. We're not simply talking about the post-war period, but also the post-Helsinki period that is there. With a NATO that is enlarging and refocused on its core function of deterrence and defense for Europe, with an EU breaking new grounds with the training of Ukrainian forces and using the EU toolbox to deliver arms and ammunition to Ukraine, with a number of countries realigning their security policies and engage in processes of joining NATO or the European Union. So to steer this discussion, ECFR has assembled a stellar panel covering a broad range of experience and perspective. First, we will have virtually Olga Stefanishyna, the Deputy Prime Minister of Ukraine, who is joining. We are at the moment trying to connect, but we are very grateful, obviously, for her being on this panel virtually in this critical moment for Ukraine. I'm also extremely grateful to Paul Johnson for joining us, and I understand straight from a plane from Asia, so you're not only bringing a European perspective, but an Asian perspective, an Indo-Pacific perspective in this conversation. We'll have Nicu Popescu, well known to the ECFR crowd, but in his capacity as Minister of Foreign Affairs of Moldova, and a few days after the Chisinau summit, so I think it's a very interesting moment. And finally, Ulrike Franke, last but not least, our dear ECFR colleague, jumped in to provide a bit of a, not only German, but a perspective on what is it that the Europeans are doing and what they could do better. So on this note, and assuming that we are still trying to connect, maybe I'll turn to Paul first to address the transformation of European security. This is has been very, very impressive, in particular in this part of Europe, with the historical decisions to seek NATO membership from both Finland and Sweden. So I won't ask you to speculate on the date of accession, because we all hope it's going to happen by Vilnius or at Vilnius, and certainly think that it's high time for this to be completed. But I would maybe start by asking you about what is your perception of the transformation of the security environment that led to this decision, maybe also with a focus on the Nordic, Baltic, Arctic region, which is of great importance to the NATO alliance. And do you think we have the right set of capabilities and plans to address all of this? So that would be my first thing to get us started. So Paul, thank you again for being here.
Thank you, Camille, and thank you for those 4 questions. I will try to distill them a little bit. And yes, well, I think the basic line here is that the Nordic area and the northern flank has changed tremendously after the war broke out. Of course, with Finland already inside NATO, Sweden hopefully on its trajectory into the alliance by Vilnius, and then of course also Denmark being now fully graded into the European security and defense policy. I think which we warmly welcome. So what were our conclusions in regards to this? I think there were several important lessons we drew. I always say that this started to a certain degree on the 17th of December 2021, when Foreign Minister Lavrov presented this legally binding security arrangement treaty or architecture, and of course stating there will be no further NATO enlargement to the east, i.e. that Sweden and Finland would no longer be sovereign nation, having the right to choose their own path to security, security, and thereby officially also being part of Russian sphere of influence. That was totally unacceptable for us. The second, I think, defining date is, of course, on the 24th of February when the war breaks out. I always say to those that are shocked when that happened, that's the failure of imagination. But what I think the conclusion that many drew was that Russia has a larger appetite for military and political risks than many thought would be likely, and also that there is obviously a difference between partnership and membership into the alliance. And we, of course, saw Ukraine being a partner to NATO and not being a member, and that makes a difference. So if you want to have access to Article 5 and NATO's common defense planning, you better join it. If I just can say join the alliance. So I think being military non-aligned and living next door to Russia, I think is increasingly difficult, to put it mildly. Well, what has changed? I think that the good thing is that the EU and NATO has never cooperated as extensively as they have done in the run-up and during the war, which is, of course, very good. I think you see a certain natural division of labor right now. I think NATO is on its right to the trajectory with the defense and deterrence agenda, with the new force model, and also the regional plans, firmly vested in Article 5 and collective defense. And the EU is provided additional security also through everything from the European Peace Facility, EU MAM Ukraine, and everything that is thus on the defense industry market. I'm thinking about the DIRPA and also ASAP and reviewing the defense industrial base. So that, if I...
Thank you very much. May I just push you a little further on the EU-NATO dimension? You rightly pointed that part of this series of decisions in the region was also the Danish decision to lift its opt-out of CSDP. It also means that because the 4 Nordic countries are now well established in both organizations, how do you see this, what could be the next steps to take this cooperation further? Because, of course, the EU has been sort of opening completely new ways of working. And I think we're in a very interesting moment from this perspective for Europe. So what would be your, as a sort of soon new member of NATO and a key player in the EU environment, your approach to all of this?
Well, I for one think that our full-fledged NATO membership is actually also going to make us stronger inside the European security and defense policy, or the common security and defense policy. And I don't really see a zero-sum game between a stronger EU and a stronger NATO. I think what is exciting now is how much further also we can go on a Nordic basis, because this is the first time in 500 years that all the Nordics now will have the same kind of security arrangement in crisis and in war times, and we're going to most of all have a common defense planning. And therefore I'm also hopeful that we can also do things on our defense posture as well. And actually both Sweden, Denmark and Norway by 2024 are going to have new defense bills presented to the parliament. And we try, as Sweden now is also sharing this NORDEFCO cooperation, we're trying to see what we can do on the regional planning, but also what we can do on our force postures, and if we can deepen our cooperation and even have a mild division of labor among us as well.
Thank you very much. It is indeed very interesting, and I always trust to audiences in France, Germany or the UK that, for instance, Air Force cooperation is de facto building with 4 countries an Air Force that's going to be larger than the German, the French or the British Air Force. So it is something that we need to pay attention to. Maybe let me now turn to Niku and of course, hard to think of more of a frontline state than Moldova in the current environment, with a very direct and dire consequences of the Russian war in Ukraine on your country. It seems to me that Mr. Putin is making the very notion of being an in-between state or a gray zone state extremely difficult. We just heard from Paul the fact that it was not necessarily comfortable to be a neighboring country and be in this sort of limbo in a way. You've been very, very instrumental in approaching this in the establishment of the European political community as a tool to deepen the political dialogue. How do you see this situation evolving today?
Of course, our geography is much less comfortable than the geography of most states in Europe, except Ukraine. This geography got significantly worse in the last 16 months. And if you just look at the map, then of course one of the most shocking parts for our country in the first days of the war was of course the war itself, but also how quickly the Russians have advanced along the Azov Sea. And if you look at where the front line was before the 24th of February, it was running through Shirokine, east of Mariupol, and the stretch from Shirokine to Kherson, which was taken within a week, is around 470 kilometers, and from Kherson to the Moldovan border is 280 kilometers. So at that rate of advance, of course, all the scenarios were being analyzed, and not many of them were very reassuring and comfortable. Luckily, Ukraine has resisted. Ukraine has proved strong, and Ukraine has been able and capable of liberating some territories. And Moldova is peaceful today thanks to Ukraine, thanks to the capacity of the Ukrainian army, society and leadership to stay strong. So for us, the primary and crucial foreign policy objective, if you want a security policy objective, is to tell everyone to continue supporting Ukraine as much as everyone can do, militarily, economically, because this is how we can return Europe to a degree of normality. The impact on Moldova was coming in, in multiple ways. Of course, our security is and has been seriously affected. I remember right before the war, with the treaty change, we were consulting with Sweden and Finland in our mutual dislike towards any type of external constraints on the freedom of choice, on whether we want to be neutral, non-aligned, or something else. And we insist on this, on this sovereign right to decide what you do and how you arrange your security arrangements. Of course, today Moldova is not militarily threatened. That's, as I said, thanks to Ukraine. But then besides that, we get the full spectrum of problems, the full spectrum of hybrid war activities and threats, cyber attacks, disinformation, fake bomb alerts, attempts to destabilize domestic politics, electricity supply problems back in autumn, we had several missile incidents when the Russians started bombing the Ukrainian energy infrastructure. We had several missile incidents with missiles crossing our space. We had blackouts because of the Russian bombing in Ukraine, where we had a dramatic reduction in gas supplies. We've coped well in the last year. It was the first year when Moldova did not use any Russian gas for heating, for example. We've maintained peace and stability and calm on our territory. There's a separatist region of Transnistria. We've been able to maintain calm around and in that region. We've been talking to the local separatist authorities to make sure that whatever differences we have, and we have a lot of differences, and talking to them is never easy, but there's a mutual commitment on both sides of River Dnistru to manage our differences through dialogue and calm, and we have managed to do this so far. But the problems, of course, are accumulating. We've had 32% inflation last year, minus 7% GDP. Of course, attracting investors is more complicated than ever. We have some successes. We have some French companies moving into renewables, Danish companies opening up shops for robotics in Moldova. So it's not entirely doom and gloom, but of course, it's more complicated than it was before the war. We're also trying everything to accelerate, deepen, expand our security and defense cooperation. We're doing a lot with the EU through the European Peace Facility, and many of you know, but while I was at ECFR with Gustav Gressel, we designed this idea that we were calling the Security Compact, which we were promoting from 2020, the spring of 2020, which ended up looking very much like the European Peace Facility today. So we've been doing a lot through the European Peace Facility with the EU. For last year, the EU gave us an amount of funding for our military that equals our military budget for last year. In the meantime, we almost doubled the military budget for this year. The APF is continuing. We're talking constantly to NATO. Just this week I was at NATO. In April I was talking to NATO. I've seen the SACEUR back in December. We're invited to the summit in Vilnius. So for us, NATO is also a force and a partner that helps us keep stability and calm and our country at peace. And of course, Romania plays a special role in everything that is Moldova's, keeping Moldova part of the free world. And of course, that also applies to security and defense issues. And I think Sweden, before before moving to NATO, had a degree of positive ambiguity where it was always believed and possibly, hinted at that if there's problems for Swedish security, Sweden would not be alone. So that's what we're trying to work on. We're trying to develop a set of relationships where we make sure that we are not alone. So we have the Romanian president coming on the record several times saying that no matter what, Moldova would not be abandoned, and that includes also security issues and defense issues. So we've been working with the Romanians, but also with all our partners to make sure that also on issues of security and defense, Moldova has a strong web of partnerships that help us make sure that no matter what happens, not just in the next 5 months or 10 months, but also in the next 5 or 10 years, that we can keep Moldova free, democratic, part of the part of the family of free European nations. And of course, a key part of all of that is our EU accession track. We've been progressing quite well. We've been implementing what needs to be implemented to fulfill the European Commission recommendations on becoming a candidate country and starting accession talks. So that is on the right track. Last week in Chisinau, also Ursula von der Leyen said that we've demonstrated amazing progress. But our task and hope is that by the end of this year, we could get an endorsement, a recommendation and an endorsement from the Commission and the EU member states that we can start accession talks. That's in a nutshell our context.
Which is a very, very both demanding and incredibly also evolving context in many different ways. May I ask you to elaborate a little further on looking from afar at the European political community construct and having attended some of the ECFR prep work in London and elsewhere recently, do you think there is a security dimension to this beyond the broader politics of having a leaders meeting and a leaders summit in Chisinau and can there be somewhere here, especially in a moment where traditional pan-European bodies such as the OSCE are themselves more locked into a situation?
So for us, the EPC, the way we could talk about the European Political Community Summit in Moldova has 3 dimensions. One, and that was very clear in the run-up to the summit, is that there's a pan-European interest in having a platform where leaders meet and they have a serious, structured strategic conversation. And within the EPC, you have 27 EU member states and 20 states which are no longer in the EU, not yet in the EU, and the others, right? But 20 states is a lot, and these 20 states don't come to the European councils, and there was a clear need on both sides to be able to talk through issues as a continent. Mm-hmm. And of course, for not countries which are not very big, like Moldova or North Macedonia or Albania, it's very important to be part of the conversation. But also we had the UK and Turkey being very interested in a format where you have a standard pace of conversations. And for the leaders from the EU, it was also very important. Okay, they talk among themselves in the European Council, but talking to the others and taking the temperature of many situations. And you could see that there were separate meetings on Armenia, Azerbaijan, on Kosovo, Serbia. That's something that is widely valued. So it's the European ANGA model, what we would call it in the couloirs. And actually I realized that that's true. I mean, there's no platform where the whole European continent regularly meets at the highest level. Then there was a big conversation on this, on what do you do concretely within the EPC, on peace and security, on energy, on connectivity, climate. And here I have to say that we're still in the early days of seeing what can be done. Some countries would rather do most of these things bilaterally or from the EU. So for now, I think on what do you do exactly within the EPC is still a conversation that hasn't been finalized. So there was talk about cybersecurity, protecting critical infrastructure. When you say connectivity in a part of the world affected by the Black Sea blockade because of the war, where those massive amounts of trade that were going through the Black Sea from Ukraine, from Moldova, has all been put on trucks, and these trucks are queuing now at all of the borders in the region. Connectivity, but in a very concrete way, wider roads of access into border crossing points, bridges, is something that has a very practical value, and that's a very practical value of keeping the Ukrainian economy as resilient as possible, is again something which would be interesting for many countries in the EPC, but it remains to be seen a bit how much more is done. And of course, the third is the Moldovan dimension of the EPC, and on that occasion, I think what the biggest achievements was for a lot of the leaders, they just felt like anywhere else in Central Eastern Europe. So for a lot of them, just the mental map of how they saw our country changed. And then there are several concrete things. We've got a roaming liberalization agreement with the EU, the first batch of EPF equipment delivered to Moldova, a big Norwegian grant for energy resilience, and many, many other announcements. And we've managed to do this. One of the, speaking of security, one of the very interesting experiences we went through was, of course, ensuring air defense during the summit with the help and contribution and presence of Romania, France, the UK and the US, and NATO AWACS flights, and working on the non-military dimension of security, on the hybrid part, on the cyber part, with ministries of interior, with ministries of defense, that really felt like being part of a security community like never before. So we want to keep this going.
Fantastic. No, thank you very much, Nico, and thank you also for flagging the fact that this sort of interaction between the sort of broader political debate and the security implications, and how these two things are a sort of constant two-way street there that really matters. We will be certainly coming back to you, but let me turn to Ulrike to provide us maybe with your sort of bold researcher assessment of how did the Europeans perform in this environment. It's been fascinating to see the adjustment of many defense policies. We were just discussing about the Sweden and Finland, but even the countries that were party to NATO and the EU before are transforming their defense policy. We have a Zeitenwende in Germany, and you're a fantastic Zeitenwende Beobachterin, and we are in this sort of moment that where the situation is changing rapidly, but are the Europeans that are in the sort of easier geography moving at pace and understanding the depth of the transformation, or are they just pretending, hoping that things will go back to before?
Yeah, so I think we actually have a Zeitenwende primarily in the European Union. And that may surprise some, because, we always hear about the EU maybe not doing enough and being slow on this. But honestly, if you look at what the EU has been doing over the last 15 months and how fast it has adapted to this new situation, I don't think anyone would have predicted that 4 or 5 years ago. I don't kind of need to throw all the acronyms around that you know very well, and we've talked about the European Peace Facility. But let's all remember that the EU really was not built for a situation like this, and in fact it was specifically built for the opposite of a situation like this. So I would say that the EU has actually tremendously well adapted. We do have EU money being spent on military equipment, on funding the European defense industry. We have, kind of special funds outside the EU budget doing all of this. So I think we really need to acknowledge that, this is kind of the main challenge for the European Union, and the EU has managed this reasonably well. That doesn't mean that more shouldn't be done, and I think more needs to be done, but I genuinely believe we are on the right track. There's also one other reason why I think we're on the right track, and that is that this development already started before the invasion of Ukraine, right? I mean, the European Defence Fund, PESCO, all of this was already put in place beforehand. And so we are kind of going in the right direction here, and I think we'll have more and more discussions within the European Union on kind of the EU becoming a defense union. And here I would like to make one point that I think people are somewhat forgetting, and that is the role of the kind of so-called neutral or non-aligned states within the European Union. Because already before the war, I was very much of the opinion that over time these countries would need to rethink their stance a lot if they didn't want to become some kind of outsiders within the European Union, because we are moving towards a European Union that is more a defense union, and we have several countries that have kind of, that don't want to necessarily be part of this, but they are part of the European Union, so they will need to reconsider. And now we have the war in Ukraine, of course, and we have Finland that has very much abandoned this position, Sweden that wants to join NATO and hopefully can do soon, Denmark that also, which wasn't neutral and non-aligned, but had a kind of special setting with regard to European defense cooperation, which has changed its views, which only leaves a few countries, namely Austria, Ireland, Malta, and Cyprus within the EU that are kind of positioning themselves outside of this. And so I very much predict that this is going to be a discussion we'll have much more going forward, and I hope that we at ECFR can also kind of contribute to having this discussion and make this work for both the EU and the national level. And yeah, coming to the national level, because of course there's kind of EU and Brussels level, and as I was saying here, I honestly, I'm rather positive. But on the national level, of course, defense capabilities, military capabilities are still very much happening on the national level. And most countries really have also had their own kind of Zeitenwende moment with the invasion of Ukraine. Of course, some already were thinking a lot about this. Some, like my own countries, were kind of somewhat rudely waken up through this invasion. But we are seeing changes there. Now, the big challenge for me, in my view, is how do we keep the momentum going that we are seeing? So take Germany. We had the very bold speech by Chancellor Scholz 3 days after the invasion, you know it all. We had a lot of kind of momentum immediately into the war. We have the 100 billion fund. I don't need to repeat all of this for you. But then it kind of felt as if it got stuck. Now we've kind of restarted the process, in my view, also with the new defense minister. But it's not just Germany that will need to keep this going if it is to yield results. I'm also thinking of Poland, which has put which has an enormous ambition when it comes to military capabilities, and you look at the numbers and really are amazed. But there is a question of how are you going to fund this in the long run, and will you be able to keep this up? So for me, this is really the moment for bold politicians and politicians that are willing to lead and guide these processes, and also guide the European populations through these changes in geopolitics, and remind them that this whole returning to normal, as Camille was just saying, is not going to happen. That this is the new normal. The idea that somehow, once this war ends, hopefully soon, hopefully the right way, we can go back to the normal that was the 1990s, that ship has sailed. And I think that's something that needs to be communicated to the European populations very, very clearly. And this is the role of national governments and national political leaders. Whether or not they're up to the task, well, we'll see. There some who are more hopeful than for others, but this I think is the task that is at hand, and you know, to some extent also a task for at least some of you here in this room.
Ulrike, may I maybe shift gears, and I will want to bring Paul into this conversation as well. One of the most fascinating thing with the war in Ukraine for military analysts is that in a way we are, and I believe we need to learn a lot from this conflict. And I would be very interested in, you know, we are now 500 days into this conflict. The Ukrainians have demonstrated not only enormous bravery, not only an ability to adapt to the equipment delivered, but also an ability to innovate and to do things differently. And I would argue that for the partners of Ukraine, for NATO, for the EU, we're going to have to learn from the Ukrainians, not only to lecture the Ukrainians as they move closer to these organizations. So what would be your take, you know, of the sort of lessons from this, including in the technology domain, because I think you've been working a lot on this, and it's really fascinating that's because it's a bit of the hidden story, because of course when we look at the images it looks pretty much like World War I or World War II, but isn't it very much a 21st century war?
Sure. I think in a way it's a tale of two stories. In one, it's very traditional, it's trenches, it's bloody, it's kinetic. It's about, to reiterate, General Cavalli, who was at our yearly societal and defense meeting in the resort of Sälen. He said this volume is about scale, scale, scale. And it's enormous volumes. And, you know, this is a war of warehouses, and we certainly in Europe have a defense industrial base for peacetime situations, and we need to review our defense industry strategies and think in terms of supply. And just, you know, you have to give it to the Russians that they've been resilient. They've taken enormous casualties, but they're able to mobilize maybe 250,000 soldiers in a partial mobilization within a couple of months, and so forth. So it's about scale and volume, but at the same time, I think it's also quite clear to me that there are things as long-range strike capabilities being very apparently used during this war. I think that air defense is absolutely crucial, and we learned quite a lot on that on different levels of air defense. Well, and of course, we've seen drones and UASs before in conflicts, but not to the same level and not between industrial states. Well, of course, drones were very important in Armenia and Azerbaijan, in Yemen, in Afghanistan, and Syria, but not to the scales. I think that autonomous systems, I think satellite-based assets being very important for everything from Starlink, secure communications to targeting and so forth. So I think there's a mix that you can learn from this as well. I mean, we are now in a unique situation as well, because what we accomplished, very much thanks to the Ramstein format and US leadership, which has been tremendous, I must say. We've been able to build 9+3 brigades in less than 6 months. I think that's an enormous accomplishment. We've been able to send hundreds of tanks, of over 1,500 infantry vehicles, hundreds of artillery systems. We have trained the Ukrainians to do combined arms and so forth, which makes me hopeful into the future. But so a lot of our systems are now also being battlefield proven, and I think there's lots of lessons to be learned on the tactical and operational level as well. So it's not just speaking to the Ukrainians, but actually learning from them a lot. And also, I think what have given them the edge is their ability to innovate, which obviously the Russian doesn't seem to have to the same scale as well.
Rika?
Yeah, if I can add to that. So I've used the description of this war as World War I with technology. And I don't think I'm the first person to come up with this, but I think it's really fitting, because on the one hand, you do have artillery, you have trenches, we're seeing, you know, dragon teeth, tank, anti-tank systems being established. So this looks very much like World War I, and at the same time you have an enormous importance of new technology, I mean drones, obviously is a big theme, and you may have seen the estimate the other day that Ukraine is losing around 10,000 drones a month. This is losing 10,000 drones a month, which gives you an idea of how many systems are in the air doing that. But also maybe more importantly than this hardware, which is what you can see, is the kind of the more hidden, the kind of software aspect of this. Because what we're very much seeing is how new tech, software, AI to some extent, is improving legacy systems, existing systems, and is making them better and faster and more efficient. And this is not the kind of, Terminator new system on the battlefield that many people have been waiting for, but it has a huge impact on the military operation. And then, of course, you have the element of, moving data into the cloud, using satellite communication, and all of this. So basically, what we're seeing, and this isn't exactly surprising to those who have been working on kind of new tech and warfare, but still noteworthy, is that you have the old conventional systems, and they very much play a role. I mean, there's a reason why I've been talking about tanks so much, and now we're talking about fighter jets and all of this. But then you have tech on top of it, or kind of improving these existing hardware systems. Two more elements I want to mention in terms of kind of lessons for Europe here. I mean, the one thing that this war has really shown is the crucial role that private companies are playing in these conflicts. And I think this is something that we're going to see even more going forward. And this is a challenge for both the state and governments and the private companies themselves. For the state, of course, it means that we have to work with private companies even more closely and also faster. I mean, the Ukrainians have very much shown how to do this. There has been a great kind of feedback loop between private companies and the Ukrainian military, with updates and upgrades and all of this being done really, all the time and on the fly. And this is something I think Western countries need to get much better at. And, outside of war, we need to establish relationships that you can then rely on during a conflict. And for the companies, but this is also a huge challenge, because, they are becoming a player in geopolitical confrontation. And we just had a great, I felt, breakout session in one of the breakout rooms talking about this, where we discussed the fact that, in my view, this war almost made it too easy for private companies to take sides, because it is a very clear breach of international law by Russia. It's clearly the aggressor. Also, Western tech companies were working quite extensively already with Ukraine and not really with Russia, and so it was kind of obvious who the companies from Microsoft, Amazon, and others would be helping. But let's be honest, there may be future conflicts in the world where countries are facing each other that have, existing relationship to, where both sides have existing relationships to private actors. And I would very much recommend for private companies to kind of set up processes now on how to deal with these situations. How do you decide who to help or not to help, whether you take sides, all of this. It also, we've also seen something else in this war with regard to private companies, and that is that, yes, on the one hand, they're really important, and Ukraine is relying a lot on them, and they're really making an impact, think Starlink terminal, but also, as a private company, you don't necessarily have control over how your systems are being used, right? So think about the Chinese DJI drones that are being used extensively in this war. I think DJI ended its operation in Ukraine and Russia a few weeks into the war. Well, that hasn't stopped tens of thousands of their drones being used. And also things like, I don't know, AI-enabled facial recognition that's easily available, being used for war purposes. That's something that companies can't necessarily control. So this is kind of something that we need to think about. And just one final point, because that's something I've been thinking about a lot, and I think this is also something that the Europeans really need to look at, is I think maybe the most novel and interesting development of this war is the way how new technologies has enabled and motivated the involvement of private people, of private individuals all over this war, all over this world in this war. And what I mean by this is that we now have people from Canada to Lithuania to Poland collecting money and giving money via social media and crowdfunding platforms for the Ukrainians to buy, well, for example, Bayraktar TB2 drones. This kind of effort is quite unique. You have people all over the world using open source intelligence to help Ukrainians identify Russian war criminals through video analysis. You have, individual citizens in Ukraine using apps to send in information on missiles coming down or Russian troop movements. So this involvement of individual people, I think, is quite novel. And the Ukrainians have been able to use that in a truly impressive way. And they've also really managed to leverage the kind of meme culture of this. I mean, I'm sure many people in this room are familiar with NAFO and all of this kind of thing. The Ukrainians have been amazing in playing this. I'm not sure other European countries would be as good. So this is something else I would very much advise Europeans to think about, this kind of, how do we deal with just individual people, citizens being so much more able and motivated to be engaged in a conflict one way or the other.
Thank you, Rika. And I think there also the other Europeans might want to learn from Swedes and Finns who have had more effort in this total defense concept and working on the relationship with society. Nico, I wanted to bring you in this on the specific angle of something you mentioned, which is the notion of hybrid threats, because obviously Moldova has been subject to a lot of hybrid activities. What is your assessment of both the situation and how we can?
Yes, indeed. We, as I said, we don't face military threats at the moment, thanks to Ukraine, but then besides this, the spectrum of threats is very wide. And here is where I think the main attack lines come through the non-military part. And in our case, for example, and that's also something we notice on the European and also North American conversation, is that suddenly everyone woke up to how important the military is. Military budgets are rising, military cooperation is increasing, military support for other countries like ours are increasing. But we have not seen a similar dynamic on the non-military side. So, for example, in the case of Moldova, a big part of the security weight is falling on the Ministry of Interior when it comes to combating hybrid threats, keeping stability. With the separatist region of Transnistria, the calm and stability around that is kept by the Ministry of Interior. When it comes to, attempts to infiltrate all kinds of intelligence personnel trying to destabilize Moldova, the burden is on the Ministry of Interior in our case and the border police. And here we have the Minister of Interior of Moldova, who is a new council member at ECFR, so she can tell you more about that. But for us, there's the military bit, but then a big burden of keeping the border safe from infiltration, keeping, the border processing fast for refugees, keeping the border safe from weapons smuggling, cyber, ensuring that bombs are not kind of placed in unexpected places around the EPC summit, a lot of it. And what we see on the international arena, actually, the ministries of interior don't have the same kind of turbocharging of their foreign policy outreach as the MODs do. So that's something what we try to explain as well, that there is the military consequences of the war. The MODs have woken up to this, but there is a big security component in our part of the world and not just in Moldova. And if you look how very large parts of Ukraine have been taken very quickly in the first days of the war, then some of it also presupposes this work on the non-military side. And then an equally important situation for us is very often if you talk of disinformation, you very quickly discovered in our case that when the Russians started bombing the Ukrainian energy infrastructure, we started having blackouts. So you come to a situation where, if I summarize it in a kind of very snappy think tank form, but if you want to combat disinformation, you need to be able to tweet. In order for you to tweet, you need to have electricity. So that you tweet, so that the population reads your tweets, and so that the population believes your tweets, right? So you get all of this continuum, military, hybrid, But in our case, with the bombing of Ukrainian infrastructure, there's a very basic need that you need to ensure. It's electricity supply. Without this, you cannot be tweeting. You don't have a functioning diplomatic service. You cannot prepare the National Commission on European Integration, which was the day after the biggest blackout we had. So a lot of these things. So for us, it's equally important to keep the ecosystem, the socio-economic stability, the electricity supply, the heating, as a way to ensure that the ecosystem and the socio-economic system does not, feed and help hybrid threats. And once we do this with the hybrid threats on a technical level, we've done really an amazing job with the colleagues in the law enforcement agencies to keep the country stable, to prevent destabilization, to prevent those people who try to violently attack the police from succeeding, to prevent people who try to take over public buildings and have been trained for that. So all of that we have been able to prevent. But again, this continuum, I think, what is happening?
Olga has joined us.
So this is where we are. And it's Olga, right?
Yes, indeed. Niku, thank you very much. And Olga, thank you so much for joining us. I understand you were literally pulled out of a meeting to be with us for a few moments, and we are extremely grateful that you could make it and participate in this conversation. We've been discussing both the enormous bravery of the Ukrainian people, of the Ukrainian forces. We've been also discussing how Ukraine is transforming not only the European security landscape, but also the way we all look at that, and that the relationship with Ukraine was going to be extremely valuable for NATO and the EU in the future as well. So in this context, without further ado, I really wanted to ask you to provide us your assessment of the situation, but also to share with us what are your expectations in the sequence we're in with an upcoming European Council, a NATO summit, and how does this matter at the moment? Because we're all watching everything and with some concerns, but also with great hopes and great support. So over to you.
Thank you so much. Do you hear me? Do you see me well?
Yes, we do.
Thank you again, and apologies for having to switch on for another meeting while I've been already in front of my screen to participate in the discussion. But indeed, I think it's very important to understand that we never stopped to be operational since the beginning of war, and basically we have seen the clear impact of decisions taken for a country. For a country like Ukraine, by granting Ukraine a candidate status. So we see the clear impact of these decisions to the unity in the country, to mobilization on the reforms agenda, and to a broader transformation and preparedness of our country to victory, and to be part of a global security order, global European agenda. So I think it's very important, both when we're talking about European integration, EU, which has shown that it's clearly the only possible and a good way to get learning in this crisis circumstances by taking actions, and actions taken for Ukraine, for Moldova, and in fact for Georgia, although they are not the candidate country, they have played its essential role to preserve the political stability in these countries, the social and political unity to keep on going and running the country throughout the war. And in fact, just before I had to switch on for this meeting, we had the urgent session of Ukrainian parliament, who's been hardly debating on structuring the EU-related agenda ahead of its urgent session, which is really important that all the country is running, all the country has a goal and a target, and all the country knows how to build a country after the war, based on the understanding that we will be part of EU. It's essentially important to have this understanding when we're talking about Euro-Atlantic integration, while expectations in Ukraine for the Vilnius summit are there, I think that from the technical point of view, the Vilnius summit is rather well prepared and discussed in terms of issues related to NATO engagement in supporting Ukraine and ensuring better interoperability with the NATO forces and application of the elements of the ammunition. But the only question which is not clear now whether this summit will pave the way to a clear roadmap of membership to Ukraine, and there are like both positive and negative sides. So the positive side of that is that the discussion is really bizarre. The discussion is really political. So it's about like what kind of wording could be taken as applicable for both sides. While there's clearly no question if Ukraine will become a member of NATO, Ukraine will become a member of NATO because all of the investments and the military support to Ukraine need to be managed. We should be fully interoperable with NATO, and Ukraine now has the most capable land forces across the globe, not only in Europe. So it's clear question which has the answer yes. So now it's about the political choreography around the process. We know the implications, but for us, two elements clear: that whatever decision will be taken on Vilnius summit related to the membership of Ukraine, it should be taken in the interest of the allies and Ukraine. It should not be taken because of the fear of Russia, because of the engagement with Russia after regaining the territory the territory of Ukraine. It should not be done from the fear that Russia will blackmail us again with that. Every decision taken for Ukraine, for allies in our interest, has been a success so far. So this model should be applied as well when we're talking about the Euro-Atlantic integration of Ukraine and decision needed there. It would be a clear signal to us, to Ukrainian people. It would be a clear understanding what comes after the victory, what comes after the successful counter-offensive measures, what comes after the war is over. This is the hardest and the most sustainable security guarantee, which is backed up not only by political promise, not only by bilateral memorandums or decisions, which you know very well Ukraine has seen in its plenty for decades. It's a security guarantee ensured by concrete administrative and military capacity, by concrete obligations within international organizations. And I think that this literally now looks as the best possible choice in a long-term perspective. So in that regard, probably I hear the sound of my voice and the messages from my side, and I might seem too radical and to energize because I'm from the country in war and everything like that. But I think the very unique skill all Ukrainian politicians gained throughout the war, which is not very much clear, is that armed forces and Ukrainian leaders at the local and central level, we become A1, which means that at some point we politicians start thinking and understanding things like military people, but also our military people are knowing that our job in terms of bringing country closer to EU and NATO is the investment into our future. They believe in that and they actually fight for that. So it's really important to understand that being at the edge of survival on a daily basis, the decisions needed and essential for our victory, they are much clearer now from Kiev, because every time we're discussing sort of an existential, structural, systemic decision or sort of a individual military elements of the military support we need, every time the end understanding that it would lead us to our survival and our victory. And we understand that no electoral process, either any other elements are equally vital than our survival and victory. And I think if we all clear about this goal, and if we all finally start understanding that Ukraine has always been there as a trustworthy, as a reliable partner, that Ukraine has never let down our values, our community, our union, and it has been proven even in the face of the full-scale war and the massive suffering, massive atrocities, possible and impossible war crimes committed on our soil, that the decisions taken for the future of Europe, they should be taken in our interest, but not out of the fear from Russia. Because everything we've seen for a bit more than 1 year is that Ukraine has proven that Russia has failed to declare any military goal, any political goal, and basically any declared goal even related to the enlargement of NATO. Everything Russia has been doing has brought to a major fear and ambiguity at the level of the politicians, but it also has led to decisions which brought to the opposite for Russia, enlarging of NATO and increasing the external border of NATO by more than 2,000 kilometers with clear security guarantees for Sweden and hopefully the decision on that. So no fear, more action is that our outreach, and we understand that the decisions on Vilnius would be essential and needed for the actions from the newly appointed Secretary General of NATO, but also for the upcoming summit in Washington, so that we would have the roadmap of actions before that decision. Thank you.
Olga, thank you very much. And this is a very, very clear message and a very powerful message. And you will have in this room a lot of supporters for Ukraine's Euro-Atlantic integration and for the fact that not only a tribute to Ukraine, but the fact that you are a very close and valuable partner seen from these organizations as well. So I think we are running very, very short. So let me, we have a couple of minutes, and I'm under instructions to not open the floor for a long series of questions. I do apologize for that because we had a fantastic discussion. Maybe one last one to Olga, because we want to take advantage of you being here and making the effort to join us, and then turning to the panelists for some final thoughts. What is it beyond the politics that you really expect from the opening sequence, from the European Union? We've been saying that the European Union has been breaking new grounds in supporting Ukraine, in organizing the support to Ukraine. You've been mentioning the important role that NATO plays in this conversation and the political messaging. But beyond the political messaging, are there very concrete steps at this very moment that you are pushing for, and you want to take advantage of this situation to pass this message?
Well, it's absolutely impossible to squeeze all our expectations into a very short message. But I would not go into details on issues related to accession talks and enlargement. Swedish presidency has done a lot here, and more decisions to come. We're committed in terms of our reform as agenda, but probably in a more structural and strategic way. I think that over the last year, the whole discourse within European Union evolved to have a greater role of EU and security and defense policy, strengthening the EU defense and launching a full-fledged European defense industry policy, discussion on the European defense procurement. And I think that this could lead to a very important transformations, which would bring us to a more coordinated European defense, more structural and coordinated prioritization of the developments of the defense industry. And I think that it would be also the most reliable element of the security guarantees, not only for Ukraine, but for the whole Europe, because we understand that the aggression should be deterred. And when we're talking about the aggression, we are not talking about only urgent elements of the military response. We see the war is raging on for more than 1 year. The counteroffensive operation has just started, and after even successful counteroffensive measures, there will be more efforts at the political level needed. So we should be prepared and resilient towards any means of the political response which might be requested. And that means about sustainable defense policy, sustainable defense planning, but also sustainable development and preparedness of the defense industry. And I think that the perspective of joint defense procurements within the EU would be a major shift, and we're looking forward, and we are expecting that EU will take a lead on this policy, and the new European Commission, which should be formed within less than 1 year, would have it as a priority task.
Olga, thank you so much, and thank you for being there. Before wrapping all of this up, I wanted to turn to all three panelists with their sort of very quick thoughts. If you have one thing that you want to take away from this conversation in sort of 30 seconds each, I'm taking advantage of having politicians on the panel. You know how to do the quick clip. So, Paul.
Famous last words, Camille. Two things. One, it all starts with the will to fight. That is the fundamental. You can have all the weapon systems in the world, but if you don't have the will to fight, the Ukrainians have shown themselves every time of the will to fight. They were terribly outgunned by the Battle of Kiev. They won the Battle of Kiev. They won the Battle of Mykolaiv. They won the Battle of Kharkiv, of the Snake Island, and so forth. We have to stop putting into conditionality that the Ukrainians have to prove themselves at every stage of the battle. We have to start thinking, of course, now about providing supplies and maintenance for the brigades we sent, but we also have to think for the second wave this fall. I think that's crucial. Last thing about Sweden and Finland. If there was one objective Russia had with Sweden and Finland, it was to keep us outside of NATO. And I call Swedish and Finnish NATO membership, that's the mother of all unintended consequences for Russian strategic thinking, because what they ended up, just as Olga said, is a 1,300 kilometer longer border with NATO. And I think that's going to make and just final point then. What is important, of course, is that Sweden's going to get Article 5, NATO's common defense planning, but Swedish and Finnish NATO membership is also about standing up for the rules-based order. The sovereignty of every country has to have the right to do their own decisions in these matters, just as Ukraine has their sovereign right to make its decisions when it comes to belonging to EU and NATO.
Cool.
I'd say that it's important to think not just about the next 5 to 10 months, but 5 to 10 years. It's important to plan for that, to ensure the sustainability of support for Ukraine on the military, but also on the socio-economic front and on the institutional front. And here I talk of accelerated EU enlargement, so that no one has the temptation to think that whatever ceasefire at some point is reached, that would be, the moment where you can move on. That will need a strong investment for the long time into the military capabilities of all of the countries in Europe, into the socio-economic stamina of maintaining support for Ukraine, and that needs to be ensured through the full spectrum, from public opinion, political consensus, to the budgets dedicated to having the support for Ukraine there for the long term.
Rika, you're on 30 seconds. We are behind schedule.
I'll keep this very short. One message to the Europeans, really. In my view, this really is the moment for political leadership to keep momentum up, to explain to the population that the world has changed and that for everything to remain the same, i.e. having a system that guarantees our interest, everything must change. And I think this really is a task, for you here in this room, for politicians, for my generation. I've written quite extensively about the millennials that are now kind of having to deal with all of this mess. And I know that Timothy Garton-Ash has written about the kind of generation 22. So I think it's up to all of us to kind of internalize the Zeitenwende as the end of history.
Thank you, Rika. Thank you please join me in thanking all our 4 panelists for a great conversation. I do apologize for not giving the floor to the audience, which has a great depth of expertise on these matters. We will continue the defense and security conversation at ECFR, but at this stage, I have the pleasure of handing the floor to our dear leader, Mark Leonard, for a conversation which is meant to cheer you up after this one. Can democracy survive the polycrisis? So, Mark, the floor is yours with Adam Tooze.